Thank you, Chris. I was going to start actually just by throwing a few more data points out, and actually in part to address your challenge earlier, Christia, about are we missing some of the elephants in the room here? And then going to talk about, I think, hopefully some practical suggestions, looking at it particularly from the perspective of the employers and what the employers need to be doing. I mean, first of all, a few data points. I mean, we do have, we've got roughly 18% unemployment across Europe, 25 million people, but there's then a further 15 million people who are, you might categorize as discouraged workers, who are either young people who just want to continue in education because there's no other alternative for them, or older people who should be working but can no longer find work, or mothers who work at home and can't find a way back into the workforce. And so those don't show up in the stats particularly, but nonetheless I think need to be seen as pools of talent and capability. We've got the whole notion of the type of work changing, and the reality that we are in a value-driven economy, high-skills economies in the developed countries largely. And it's not just because Asia and other countries have taken away more of the low-cost work. Actually, they're moving up the value spectrum as well. But of course, we've improved productivity, we've automated, and actually, if you look through the current economic crisis, the biggest cut in jobs, of course, was more towards the bottom, the administrative tasks, the entry-level tasks for many people. According to CEDAFOP, we are looking at something like a rise of 18 million jobs across the EU in the next 10 years or so, which are high-skilled versus a drop of 11 million jobs across the EU in low-skilled. So I think that points to it, and another little data point is a shortage of potentially up to 700,000 IT workers by 2015 in Europe, according to the European Commission. So again, it just highlights this notion that it's the nature of work in some degree that is shifting as well, and we must understand that. We've already heard that the traditional relationship between job vacancies and high unemployment, the so-called beverage curve, is broken. And it's this paradox that we're in where employers are saying they can't find the skills, they have open positions, and yet we've got high unemployment, which clearly points to one of the big issues we've been touching on. At the same time, and I'm going to build on this a little bit more, it's distressing to note that in a recent survey that Accenture did, that 80% of employers report freezing or reducing training spend, at the same time as almost half the businesses reporting skill shortage. So there's this continued notion that training is an expendable thing. It's an expense. The HR community, the human resources community, have been very poor at expressing the value that comes out of training. And like many things in the wider educational sector, we're extremely good at measuring inputs and very poor at measuring value and output. And we've got to change some of that. And I think, of course, government austerity measures have been further constraining the skills thing. It's interesting, I was looking at a piece of research from the OECD and something called the European Foundation for Improvement of Living and Working Conditions, and they do various reports on working conditions in Europe, which showed a pretty sorry story for Spain in terms of its relative expenditure through employers on training, as low as 15%, when the highest countries in the world, so 15% of their workers being trained by their employer in the last year, versus economies, particularly in the Nordic region and Netherlands, places like that, who were as high as 40 or 50% of their workers having been trained in the last year. So, as I said, it's again pointing to an issue that we can't expect to solve the problems if we don't take on board the fact that actually we've got to do something about it as employers and training the skills. So let me move on to some of what I would think of as the key imperatives. So sort of three areas to think about. The first is what I think of as employers stepping up. They can't just point fingers at everybody else. Employers have got to step up and think about some of this differently. We've certainly got to do something about improving mobility and transferability of skills, and we've touched on that and had a few thoughts on that. And finally, what I've described as strengthening the skills ecosystem, which is about education as well as, I say, the role of employers in the educational system. So first of all, on employers stepping up, employers are very good at recruiting their own image and believing that everybody's got to look the same. We have recruitment policies and practices that tend to reinforce that. So we've got to think much more broadly about how we recruit more diverse workforces, and that's not just a corporate social responsibility thing, because I always believe actually in business you can't just confuse altruism with business. You've got to make the business case for it to make it sustainable. So there are real business reasons and benefits to have a more diverse workforce. You get more innovation from them, you tap into different talent pools, they're more representative of your customer base, you typically get a lot more engagement and so on. But we've got to have more flexible working practices to enable a lot of that. It's not just about recruitment, it's about how do we manage our workforce in a more flexible way. So all these flexible working practices, for example, home and remote working. I've been working with a US-based call center outsourcing business called Aspire, who have 25,000 workers in the US, and they all work from home, every single one of them. They're typically women, of course, in the middle western states, and they are working as call center operatives for large global corporations. So we're rethinking the models of employment in that regard. Job sharing and part-time working, and job sharing not just in two of the same people sharing a job, but an older person sharing with a younger person, so you get a knowledge and skills transfer. Even models which have emerged more recently, such as the German Kurzarbeit program that happened during the recession. They said, don't just get rid of all these people, keep them, because otherwise you lose those skills, and when things come back, then you could utilize those skills more effectively, and the government helping with the kind of gap there. And of course, the vast growth in freelancing and contracting. I mean, Karen's pointed out, and many of you know the stats, that most young people today would say they don't want to work for large corporations. They want to work for themselves, they want to be freelancers. So again, we're going to take advantage of that in the broader skills ecosystem, and large organizations figuring out better ways to engage and connect freelancers and contractors to the broader corporate purpose, and not just treat them as cannon fodder to be got rid of at the first opportunity. And obviously, all of the investment in retraining and skills building, all the way through apprenticeships, work experience programs, and so forth, really playing their part as businesses in helping young people get into work. So there's a lot there around employers stepping up, and it's something I work with a lot on, trying to educate and talk to senior business leaders about not just their corporate or social responsibility in all of this, but why is this a good thing to do from a business perspective, and making that connection. The second area, so improving mobility and transferability of skills, and again, a few commentators have touched on this, but there are a lot of challenges in mobility, all the way from comparability of qualifications, and businesses finding it quite hard to say, we have this famous statistic, for example, that there are 3 times as many engineers coming out of China now as there are in the United States. Well, are they equivalent? Do they have the equivalent skills? If we looked at qualifications of people coming out of particularly vocational education in Germany, are they the same skills that I might see in the United Kingdom? We have very little equivalence. We've worked on things like the Bologna process and the Erasmus exchange programs, and there are targets from the EU to increase that. But I think from a business perspective, we could do more with mobility if we could better understand the baseline of skills that we were dealing with. Certainly, to some degree, reducing regulatory complexity, and I'm not a massive fan. I mean, I think the way Dan put it right, is smart regulation rather than just regulation being cut for its own sake. But if you ask businesses today, a lot of them, and I think they hide behind it to a degree, say that regulation is making it hard for them to be flexible in their working practices and mobility of people. But there are some things like the EU Blue Card and so forth, trying to increase ease of moving high-skilled workers around Europe, and indeed, of course, that's not just around Europe, but into Europe from other parts of the world. But I think it's going to require attitudinal change. I mean, we've heard in Spain the challenges of the culture, which says that people don't move. And we have to fix that. It's both employers showing that opportunity, and maybe you take the work to the individual through technology and home working and those other things, but we have to do something also to encourage young people to move more, to find the work. And then the third area I wanted to touch on was increasing or strengthening what I think of as the skills ecosystem. And that begins with a better debate and understanding of what are the skills we actually need. I mean, we started last night with a slightly provocative question, which I will rephrase because it was too provocative. But what is Spain going to be famous for in the future? And what are its core skills, how does it differentiate in a global economy? And it's no good saying we're all good at everything, and I actually don't, although yes, you could say it's done a lot of construction, I don't think that's an industry that can compete on globally. You go to the Middle East, and there's everybody going to the Middle East, particularly young Indians and so forth, because for them, that's a perfect opportunity, because they're going to earn a lot more money than they would at home. But whether it's construction, whatever it is, what are the skills, what are the areas of business and industry that Spain could be famous for? And then from a business perspective, being much more articulate on what are the future skills we need. Most businesses are very poor at long-term skills planning, very poor at it. And we've got to get better in that debate between government and business as to what are the kind of industries that we can grow, what are the sorts of skills we need. And of course, what you come back to time and time again is the notion, yeah, I need STEM skills for sure, but that's overplayed as well. There are many other skill sets that play into business equally effectively. And actually what we need is a broader base of skills, because we can't predict what the skills will be. Technology is changing things so fast, and you write all these job titles down, and they're all changing. So, we need to move off to tighter definition of what those skills, think more broadly, but we must think about what is Spain going to be famous for in the future. So through all of that, we need greater collaboration between employers and the educational system, and that's got to work both ways. I think for too long, employers have pointed the finger at education and say, why aren't you producing the skills we need? Why are these young people not employable? And the answer is, business has got to get in the mix and help to define what skills we need to help create the opportunities for building employability skills through things like work experience, all the way through into primary skills. And Louisa and I sit on the board of an organization called Junior Achiever, which does just that and is aiming to hit 5 million students in Europe in the next 5 years, to bring business people into schools and give those young people an exposure to what it means to be a business person. We absolutely must also extend, in my view, vocational education. I simply don't believe that the answer is, I think somebody said it before, it's about more education. It's not about more education, it's about smarter education. And this idea that we need to continue to put more young people through university, I think is a long-held fallacy. In the UK, we have been targeting through successive governments 50% of our young people to go to university, which makes no sense whatsoever. The country can't afford it, the young people can't afford it. It's creating young people with a high expectation, let alone lacking the skills we need. We have got to get the balance back into vocational education, and not just seeing vocational education and apprenticeships as about trade skills, which somebody said before. It's not just about being a bricklayer or a painter. And actually what it's about, and I'm working with a lot of knowledge economy companies in the UK now on building apprenticeship programs into things like legal firms, professional services firms, financial services, and so forth. And they are doing this not because it's corporate social responsibility, but because it is a good thing. They get young people at a younger age, they're more loyal, they stay longer, they do the things they want to do with a less expectation graduates have, and they build the skills that they need. So I really want to see a stronger debate on vocational education supported by government, and therefore the final point would be, what should we invest in education? Finland is an interesting example of a country that went counter-cyclical in its investment in education, the complete reverse of pretty much what everybody else does. When the economic downturn hits, we look at austerity measures and start to cut the spend in education. Finland did the reverse. However, they were absolutely clear it wasn't just about throwing money at education, it was about defining what we needed education to produce in terms of skills and employability. And in the mid-80s, when they had one of their big crises in the Nordic countries, they invested hugely in building technology skills, encouraging young people to go into technology. With the result, they created a talent pool that has seen the emergence of companies like Nokia. And we've got to think about that perspective as well. So investing more smartly in education, looking at alternative education channels such as vocational education, but bringing the partnership together between business, government, and the educational establishment to start to figure out how we build the right skills for the next 10 years.
Peter, thank you.